The air inside the courtroom was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that clung to every corner of the room. The dull hum of fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound that dared to break the silence, casting an eerie glow over the polished marble floors. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, a sea of faces watching intently, some leaning forward in quiet anticipation, others whispering among themselves in hushed voices. There was an electric charge in the atmosphere, a collective sense that something was about to unfold, something worth remembering. At the center of it all sat Charles Whittaker, a man who, at first glance, seemed ordinary. But beneath the surface, past the rumpled suit and the tired eyes, was a life filled with wrong turns and bad decisions, each one leading him to this moment. His hands rested on the defendant's table, fingers twitching slightly, betraying the nervous energy coursing through him. His gaze flickered across the room, darting from the jury to the prosecutor, to the rows of spectators who had come to witness his fate. But no matter where his eyes landed, they always returned to the front of the room. There, seated behind the imposing wooden bench, was Judge Naomi Ellis. She was a striking presence, not just because of her position, but because of the sheer force of her demeanor. She exuded an air of unshakable authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced, only felt. Her posture was upright, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes scanning the notes before her with a calm, calculating gaze. She had seen countless cases before this one. Countless men like Charles, each with their own stories, their own desperate attempts to outrun the consequences of their choices. And yet, despite the weight of the room, despite the pressure that would have made a lesser person falter, she remained composed. For many in the room, she was an anomaly, a black woman in power in a courthouse where the faces of authority had long been predominantly white. Some in the audience watched her with admiration, seeing in her a symbol of progress, of justice that refused to be bent by the old ways. Others, however, viewed her with skepticism, their expressions betraying their doubts about her ability to wield the power she had earned. Charles wasn't sure what to make of her. He had spent years getting by on his ability to talk his way out of trouble, to charm his way past authority figures who either underestimated him or were willing to cut him a break. But Judge Ellis didn't look like someone who could be persuaded or intimidated. She looked at him as if she had already seen through him, as if she knew every excuse he was about to give before the words could even leave his mouth. He swallowed hard, shifting slightly in his chair. The weight of the moment was pressing down on him, wrapping around his chest like an iron grip. He had been in courtrooms before, had faced judges before. But this time, it felt different. The stakes were higher. The walls seemed closer. And for the first time, a creeping realization settled into the back of his mind. He might not be able to talk his way out of this one. The moment the prosecutor, Leslie Hayes, rose from her chair, the energy in the room shifted. She was sharp, confident, and relentless, the kind of attorney who had built a career dismantling the defenses of men like Charles Whittaker. Adjusting her blazer with practiced ease, she strode to the center of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the floor like the ticking of a countdown clock. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, precise. "The defendant, Charles Whittaker, is not a victim of circumstance. He is a career criminal who has spent years evading justice. Theft, assault, repeat offenses. This is not a man who has made one mistake. This is a man who has built a life out of breaking the law." Charles's jaw tightened. He wanted to scoff, to shake his head, to roll his eyes like he had done in other courtrooms before. But something about the way she said it, the certainty in her tone, the cold assurance that she had him cornered, made his throat dry. As she spoke, a large screen flickered to life beside her, displaying grainy surveillance footage. Charles didn't need to look at it to know what it was. He had been there. He had lived it. But seeing himself on screen, his blurred figure shoving a convenience store clerk aside, stuffing cash into his pockets, turning his back on a scene of chaos, it felt different now. The prosecutor didn't pause. Another clip played, another crime. Then another. With each frame, the weight in his stomach grew heavier. "Multiple eyewitnesses," she continued, flipping through the pages of her notes. "Store owners, victims, police officers. People who have seen Mr. Whittaker not just commit crimes, but repeat them, again and again, with no regard for the law or for the people he has hurt." Charles clenched his fists beneath the table. His lawyer, George Patterson, remained painfully silent beside him, flipping through a legal pad as if the answer to saving his client was buried somewhere in the margins. Patterson had been appointed to him, and though Charles had hoped for someone willing to fight, He had quickly realized that his lawyer was nothing more than a quiet spectator in a battle already being lost. A bead of sweat trickled down the side of Charles's face. His eyes darted toward the door. The thought crept into his mind before he could stop it. Could he run? Could he make it out of this room before they caught him? No. That was stupid. There were 2 armed bailiffs standing at the exits, watching him like wolves watching an injured animal. He was trapped. His usual tricks, charming his way out, sweet-talking the judge, putting on a performance of regret, weren't going to work here. Not with Judge Ellis. She hadn't said much yet, but he could feel her gaze on him. Watching. Studying. Seeing straight through him. Panic twisted in his gut. For years, he had been in control, slipping through the cracks of the system, talking his way out of trouble, moving on before the consequences could catch up. But not today. Today, it was as if the walls were closing in, leaving him with nowhere to turn. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the words of the prosecutor as she continued listing his charges, his crimes, his failures. He pressed his palms against the table, feeling the slickness of sweat on his skin. He was losing control. And for the first time in his life, he knew it. The silence that followed the prosecutor's final statement was deafening. The weight of her words pressed against Charles's chest like a heavy stone, suffocating him, trapping him. His mind raced, desperately grasping for an escape, a way out, anything that could loosen the noose tightening around his fate. The realization that this was it, that there was no last-minute reprieve, no easy way out, sent a wave of panic crashing over him. His lawyer sat still, unmoving, useless. The jury watched him with cold indifference, the spectators with morbid fascination, and at the front of it all, Judge Ellis, unwavering, unreadable. She hadn't spoken much, but her silence was louder than anything else in that room. Charles swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. He needed to act. He needed to turn the tide before it was too late. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the burning in his chest, forcing his voice to remain steady. This isn't who I am, he started, his words tumbling out faster than he intended. I know what they're saying. I know how this looks. But I'm not some monster. I have a family. A wife, kids, they need me. I can't, he hesitated, forcing a tremor into his voice, hoping to sound desperate, hoping to make them see him as a man, not a criminal. I made mistakes, yeah, but doesn't everyone? I'm not asking for a free pass, just a chance. A real chance. I swear if I could take it all back, I would. His eyes searched the room, pleading, trying to find even one sympathetic face. But all he saw was the same blank expressions, the same quiet judgment. He turned back to Judge Ellis, locking onto her. She was the one who held his fate. If he could just make her see him, really see him, maybe, just maybe, he could still salvage this. But she didn't flinch. She didn't nod, didn't frown, didn't give him even the slightest sign that his words had moved her. She simply stared. The silence stretched. It crushed him. It mocked him. And then just like that, something inside Charles snapped. The fear, the desperation, the hopelessness that had been clawing at his insides finally boiled over, giving way to pure rage. His hands clenched into fists, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Nobody in this damn room understands. His voice was no longer controlled. It was raw, unfiltered, furious. Not one of you. You sit there in your suits, acting like you know me, like you know what it's like to be stuck in a hole with no way out. Like you've ever had to fight just to survive. The pressure in his chest was unbearable now. He could feel the walls closing in, suffocating him. And then, he moved. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't planned. It was pure, reckless instinct. Before anyone could react, before logic could stop him, Charles lunged straight toward the judge. A collective gasp tore through the room. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor, of bodies shifting in panic, of someone shouting his name, all blurred into a deafening roar. A bailiff reached for his weapon. A woman in the front row covered her mouth, eyes wide in horror. The tension snapped like a live wire. But through it all, through the chaos, the gasps, the movement, Judge Ellis did not move. She did not recoil. She did not flinch. She simply sat there, waiting. Watching. And in that split second, Charles knew he had made a mistake. The entire courtroom seemed to move in slow motion. Gasps filled the air, chairs scraped against the marble floor, and the bailiff's hand hovered over his holster, ready to act. The tension was suffocating, pressing down on every person in that room like an invisible force. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, Judge Naomi Ellis did not move. She remained seated, her expression unreadable, her hands resting lightly on the bench as if she had anticipated this moment long before it happened. As Charles lunged forward, his body tense with anger, his face twisted in a mix of rage and desperation, she did something that no one, least of all Charles, expected. She raised a single finger. Not in warning, not in fear, but in absolute command. Her index finger lifted smoothly, sharply, as if drawing an invisible line in the air. Not a frantic movement, not a defensive gesture, a statement. It stopped Charles in his tracks. Just inches from the judge's bench, his body froze. The fury that had driven him forward, the white-hot anger that had made him reckless, suddenly faltered. His breath hitched. His fists, once clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white, loosened ever so slightly. It wasn't the bailiff reaching for his weapon that had stopped him. It wasn't the collective shock rippling through the courtroom. It was her. Judge Ellis. She looked at him, not with fear, not with panic, not even with contempt. She simply looked. Her voice, when she spoke, was not raised. It did not tremble. It cut through the silence with a quiet authority that shook him to his core. Losing control does not make you powerful, Mr. Whitaker. Her words landed with the weight of a gavel. It only proves how weak you truly are. The room was dead silent. Charles could feel every eye on him, the jury, the spectators, the officers at the door. But none of them mattered. None of them existed in that moment. Only her. His chest heaved. The anger that had fueled him just seconds ago, anger at the system, at the people in this room, at himself, began to crumble piece by piece. Judge Ellis didn't blink. She didn't waver. You chose this path, she continued, her voice as steady as ever. And now, you must take responsibility for it. Something inside him shattered. For the first time, Charles felt the full weight of what he had done. Not just today. Not just in this moment. His entire life. He had spent years blaming others. The world. The system. The people who never gave him a fair shot. But now, standing before this woman who had seen through every lie, every excuse, there was nothing left. His rage, his defiance, his desperation, all of it was gone. There was only the truth. And the truth was, he had done this to himself. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the courtroom as the bailiffs moved in. Charles didn't fight them. He didn't struggle. He didn't lash out. The rage that had carried him to this moment had drained from his body, leaving behind nothing but a hollow silence. His wrists were seized, strong hands gripping him on either side as they pulled him back, but he barely felt it. His mind was elsewhere. For the first time in his life, he had no words. No quick lies, no excuses, no desperate attempt to twist the truth into something that worked in his favor. There was nothing left to say. He cast one last look toward Judge Ellis. She was still watching him. But now, there was something different in her gaze, something far more piercing than judgment. Clarity. Finality. A truth he could no longer escape. The courtroom doors swung open. Cold air rushed in. As the officers let him out, he glanced back at the room he was leaving behind. The spectators, still frozen in stunned silence, the prosecutor, her lips pressed into a thin line, and his own lawyer, still seated at the defense table, flipping through his notes as if the case had already been written into history. But above all of them, standing at her bench, was Judge Naomi Ellis. Her voice rang out, calm, unwavering, undeniable. Justice is not something that can be intimidated, bribed, or bent to one's will. Justice serves only the truth. Her words carried through the room like an unshakable force, pressing into every person present. The kind of words that demanded to be remembered. She had not needed to raise her voice. She had not needed to react in fear. In the face of Charles's fury, she had remained firm, unmoved, unshaken. And that, more than anything, had sealed his fate. This was no longer just a trial. It was a lesson. A lesson in power, not the kind that came from anger or force, but the kind that came from control, wisdom, and an unbreakable sense of justice. A lesson in strength, not the kind that lashed out in frustration, but the kind that stood firm in the face of chaos. And above all, a lesson in truth, The kind that could not be escaped, no matter how many lies were told to cover it up. As the doors closed behind him, as the last glimpse of the courtroom faded from his sight, Charles felt something he had never felt before. Not rage. Not defiance. Defeat. Not just at the hands of the law, but at the hands of himself. Power and rage are often mistaken for one another. But in that courtroom, in that defining moment, it became clear that true power is not found in the loudest voice, nor in the angriest outburst. It is found in control, in certainty, in knowing that justice does not bow to chaos. Charles Whittaker had believed, for most of his life, that control meant intimidation. That power belonged to those who could force their way through situations, who could manipulate, who could take what they wanted without consequence. He had lived by that belief, convinced that the world owed him something, convinced that if he fought hard enough, yelled loud enough, struck first, he would always come out on top. But in the face of Judge Naomi Ellis, he had learned the truth. She had not shouted him down. She had not reacted in fear. She had not let his anger shake her resolve. Instead, she had held steady. She had shown him, in a way that no prison sentence, no lecture, no punishment ever could, that his rage did not make him strong, it made him weak. Because control was never his to begin with. His choices had led him here. No one else's. The system had not forced his hand. The judge had not predetermined his fate. He had written his own downfall, line by line, mistake by mistake. For the first time, as he sat in the cold, empty holding cell, Charles understood that his greatest enemy had never been the law. It had never been the people who stood against him. It had been himself. Judge Ellis had known that long before he did. She had seen him for what he was. Not a man without hope, but a man unwilling to take responsibility. And in the face of his fury, she had shown him something he never expected. Strength. Not the kind that lashes out, not the kind that intimidates, but the kind that endures. That is the power of justice. That is the power of calm in the face of chaos. And that is why Judge Naomi Ellis did not lose that day. She did not simply preside over a courtroom. She commanded it. And she did so not with fear, not with force, but with truth. Some stories stay with us long after they've been told. They echo in our minds, leaving behind questions, reflections, and a deeper understanding of the world around us. This was more than just a courtroom trial. It was a battle between chaos and control, between blind rage and unwavering justice. Charles Whittaker walked into that courtroom believing that anger could change his fate. He left understanding that true power doesn't belong to those who lash out. It belongs to those who stand firm in the face of adversity. Judge Naomi Ellis did not just uphold the law that day. She proved that justice is not about fear, nor about force. It is about truth.
En ze trut vil alvis reis ab over zijn oase.
But what do you think? Did Judge Ellis's composure change the course of this trial? Could things have ended differently if Charles had chosen another path? Let's talk about it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you stop and think, consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more powerful stories about justice, resilience, and the lessons that shape our lives. Because sometimes, the most important truths are found in the moments we least expect. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away, take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change.
Comment below and tell who es your toekomst.
Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.